This is the Comics Alternative for Young Readers, a special look at the 2016 Eisner Award winners.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative for Young Readers. I'm Andy.
And I'm Gwen, and we're two people with PhDs talking about comics.
And today's podcast will be a little bit different. This is actually a special show that we're doing about the recently announced Eisner Award winners. And if you're not familiar with the Eisner Awards really are the industry's largest, most important, or probably more... The award that most people know about when they talk about comics. It's kind of like the Oscars of the movies. And those awards were just voted on at the San Diego Comic-Con. And we'll be talking about that in a little bit. And there's so much to talk about. In fact, we've been talking off the mic a little bit, and we're getting really, really worked up in a good way. But before we get to those titles, we want to let everybody know that this episode of the Comics Alternative for Young Readers is sponsored by Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com for all of your pre-ordering needs. There you'll find titles from DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse at 40% off, and you'll find books from other publishers at 20 to 35% off. And sometimes they have specials that run 45 to 50% off the cover price. And sometimes, Gwen, the discounts get even more impressive than that.
This is true. And this month, DCBS has, we'll go ahead and start off with their Marvel Kids bundle. They have 3 issues, Marvel Universe Avengers, Ultron Revolution, Marvel Universe Guardians of the Galaxy number 12, and Marvel Universe Ultimate Spider-Man versus the Sinister Six number 3. All those comics for $4.47, which is 50% off of the cover price.
Wow.
And, I know. And they have 2 of the comics that we're going to be talking about today, 2 Eisner Award winners. Little Robot by Ben Hatke is 30% off at just $11.98. And Jillian Tamaki's SuperMutant Magic Academy is $16.06, which again is 30% off the cover price. So if you want to get a hold of a couple of the Eisner winners that we're going to be talking about today, DCBS would be a great place to go.
That is really, really cool. I mean, there's so many great deals there, and I know we're going to be talking about some of the books that Gwen mentioned in more detail. So please do visit our sponsor, DCB Service, for all of your pre-ordering needs. And Gwen, this is so cool. You know, I've always listened to Derek and Andy talk about the Eisners, and I was always thinking, I wish they would focus more on the young readers stuff. And now we're getting to do that. So that's really cool.
It is, and I'm really happy that over the last 4 or 5 years, the Eisner Awards have really started to think a lot about young people, young readers, to promote those texts and to create 3 separate categories now for young readers. They have Best Publication for Early Readers, which is up to age 8, Best Publication for Kids, aged 9 through 12, and Best Publication for Teens, aged 13 through 17. Now, as we talk, later on in the show, we're going to sort of, both say that that's really great that there are those categories and that so many awards now can be given out for young readers. But we're also maybe going to call into question those age ranges a little bit, and maybe as a preview, think a little bit about maybe beginning to look at awards for young people's comics that are based more on genre. So we have a lot to look forward to today.
We really do, and I'm really excited about it. And you're exactly right. There are, the awards have evolved quite a bit, and like you said, the categorization has evolved too. And I think in a good way. I think it's moving more toward a concept that is more inclusive and that's more fair, and actually that gets more books in front of people's sight, which is really what we want. If you're not familiar with Comic-Con, in fact, you've probably, if you're on social media at all, parents or young readers, you see a lot of stuff about Comic-Con. And I just wanted to give just a little brief talk about that. Comic-Con, actually, you would think it's just a comic book convention. And, it may have started out that way, way back. But now Comic-Con is this enormous monster. And it's not just comics. It's also movies, it's television, media, gaming. So, if you were to go to Comic-Con, you would probably be inundated with just tons of stuff. And comics is just a part of it, but a very, very important part in which they, as we said before, give these Eisner Awards out. So if you have no idea what we're talking about as far as Comic-Con, I would encourage you to go to comiccon.org, and that's COMIC-CON.org. And there's a tab there where they have the awards, and you can actually look at all of the books that were nominated as well as the books that won. But Gwen, before we, that's just a very, very brief history of Comic-Con and what happens there. So why don't we get started with the first category, which is the best publication for early readers, and that is readers up to age 8.
Yeah, there are, in this particular category, there were 5 entries. And I'll go ahead. Why don't I go ahead and let everyone know what those entries are, and then we'll talk a little bit about the books.
Okay.
The first is Anna Banana and the Chocolate Explosion, and this is actually a comic written by a mother and son team. Dominque Roques is the author, and Alexis Dormal, her son, is the illustrator. And this was translated from the French. So they're basically, they tend to write in French. That's where they publish, and this book was then picked up for the States, which is great. And that's First Second, of course. We love First Second, so yay. The second text was Little Robot by Ben Hatke, which you and I reviewed. It's a beautiful wordless comic. The third entry is The Only Child by Zhou Jing. And again, that's a comic that you and I reviewed on our show. She, he, we. And I just want to sort of say that because it sounds funny. It's the word she, the word he, and the word we all sort of collapse together by Lee Nordling and Merrick Bosch. And finally, the last text put out by TOON Books is written and drawn by Henrietta by Linier. And Linier is a Belgian comics creator. So it's kind of exciting to see that 3 actually of the comics that were nominated were written by people who do not have English as their first language. Zhou Jing is from China. So it's kind of cool to have such an international representation.
Yeah, it really is. And, as we were talking before we went on mic, there's so much diversity, as you mentioned, just not only the creators, but the age levels. I mean, it's called Best Publication for Early Readers up to age 8, and that covers quite a bit of territory. Anna Banana and the Chocolate Explosion is probably one suited for a very, very young reader. In fact, you might even call it a picture book for young children. And the same thing for Written and Drawn by Henrietta, which is a lot of fun. I just love this book. But those would be books for children at probably the extreme, not the extreme, but very, very young readers, certainly pre-age 8. While Little Robot is a little bit more sophisticated, and then The Only Child is a very sophisticated book that works on so many levels. So we've got so many different kinds of books here, and we can go ahead and tell people that the winner in this category was Ben Hatke's Little Robot.
Yeah, and we were, I think, both pretty excited about that. We reviewed that way back, I think, in August or September of last year, and it's a comic that stuck with me. In fact, I'm currently working on an essay with a colleague on Little Robot. So, and also, coming up, we'll probably be reviewing another book by Ben Hatke. This one is called Mighty Jack, and it's set in the same story space as Little Robot. So it should be really exciting. We'll get to sort of rejoin that universe and talk about Hatke's work going forward. Yeah, just to get back to what you were saying there, though, certainly Anna Banana and the Chocolate Explosion feels very much like a picture book, and it's basically a text in which a little girl and her stuffed animals make a cake, or try to make a cake, and
with not quite the best results.
Yeah, there's nothing stickier than cake batter, I'm just going to say it, and it gets all over. And I think it's one of those like really lighthearted comics that's quite fun. I will say that Written and Drawn by Henrietta is interesting. I think in one of our shows recently when I talked about attending the Children's Literature Association conference in June, I mentioned that Joe Sutliff-Sanders and Charles Hadfield had talked about TOON Books and the history of TOON Books and how they had hired an educational consultant to come up with a guide for parents both on how to read comics with their children, but also how to determine which comics to purchase for their kids. And this particular comic, actually, they have three categories. So like the first category, everything is really simple. It's mainly pictures. It's simple sort of, if there is text, it's simple juxtapositions of text and language. The second level, you start to look at the way the panels work together. And the third level is far more sophisticated. And that's actually what they designate written and drawn by Henrietta. Nonetheless, I mean, I think I agree with you, Andy, because it's definitely a text that I would say probably is appropriate for kids who are just learning to read. And it's a really cute, creative story that I think encourages creativity in young readers. It reminds me a little bit of a very elaborate Harold and the Purple Crayon.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that, but that is right on target.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that I think that it's the kind of text that could generate a lot of interesting discussion between an adult chaperone and a child who would be going through the book together in terms of, well, if you were in the story, what would you have drawn? Or, notice, I love the part sort of right in the middle of the text when Henrietta, who's drawing this story, has writer's block. Mm-hmm. And she doesn't know where to go with the story. And that's so real. I'm actually going through it right now myself on a couple of projects. So I felt a kinship there to Henrietta. But on a serious note, it shows how she works through that writer's block and ends up coming up with a story that's both sweet and funny and inventive. And so I really actually loved the text. But again, like Anna Banana, it's a somewhat contained story, very short. Whereas, say, The Only Child, which we both really loved too, I know, it's a lengthier story. It's got a lot more symbolism going on there. It's drawn and set in a different culture. So it has a different feel to it, I think, much more reminiscent, say, of Sean Tan's The Arrival on that level of sophistication. But tell me, we also both read She, He, We, and I'm wondering about your sense for that text.
Well, I'll tell listeners that if you have not read She, He, We, this is part of what I suppose to be a series by Lee Nordling and Meritwell Bosch. It's a very imaginative, somewhat unconventional book, and it's another wordless book, except for the introductory and the closing pages. We've got three different storylines going on, and in the first storyline, Alex is having a tea party with friends. In the second, Drew flies through the sky, fighting forces of darkness. And on the third, two children are playing in a park, pretending that they're somewhere else. And these stories are all presented horizontally across the page, but you can also read them vertically. And I was kind of describing it earlier, Gwen, as sort of a choose-your-own-adventure visually.
Right.
And while I really, really like the idea of that, and again, this kind of fits in with some of the creativity that is inherent in Written and Drawn by Henrietta, the creativity, though, in this part is the child learning, what do I want to focus on? How do I want to read this story? How do I want it to flow? Gwen, I found it somewhat confusing as a book. I'm not sure. And then, of course, I'm a 54-year-old man trying to read this book that was written for children. A child might have a different experience, will certainly have a different experience with it. So this is a book that is very different from the other books in the way that it's structured.
Well, I think that part of the overarching message of that text is both children want to play different games, but they're able to play in the same space together. And therefore, I think the point is you can go to a place, play with other children, but kind of also be in your own world or do the things that you want to do. I will say that the games that the characters want to play are sort of gendered. And, we have the she wanting to basically have a tea party. We have the he wanting to fight forces of evil. The we is when they sort of come together, but they're playing different things. I I will also say, though, Andy, I had the same response. I felt like I need a child to lead me through this. It wasn't as intuitive. Earlier in the year, we had reviewed a book out of I think it was edited by Jenny Holm, if I'm correct, and maybe a couple of other folks. Stories that dealt with lunch, right? And it's I loved that collection. And a couple of those stories were also very meta in the way that they sort of were trying to show young people different ways of reading a comic. Remember the one we liked so much that had arrows that sort of pointed different, you could follow different storylines based on.
Yeah, that was the Jason Shiga story?
Right. I mean, to me, that was a little clearer. This one, I think, would definitely need an adult chaperone for a younger reader to help them work through the choices, even though it is very carefully set out in the front. Like you, I was sort of sitting there thinking, okay, I'm having a little trouble with this, and but it's beautifully drawn. I mean, I don't want to take away from the aesthetics of it, and I think that it provides a nice puzzle for kids. But it was just maybe a little less intuitive for me, and so that brings us to the last text in the category, the one that won, and that is Little Robot by Ben Hatke.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that this won. And Gwen, you probably remember the conversation we had about this one back in October, but both of us brought out the fact that Hatke's protagonist here is a young African American girl, but not many people at the time of the release seem to be talking much about that aspect of it. And I was so glad to see it was nominated, and even more glad to see it win. And I'm actually hoping that more people will start talking about the protagonist being a young African American girl.
Yeah, that's actually the subject of a part of the subject of an essay that I'm writing with another colleague. We're interested less in what Hatke did, because we don't want to, basically say that he doesn't have the right to write about that, or that he shouldn't have written about it. And I think he did a beautiful job of creating the text. But on the other hand, portrayals of African American children are so rare in children's literature that when they appear, they should be talked about and commented on, because, again, it's something that we're both happy about, but we also want to make sure that the portrayal is sensitive. I think Hatke's done a beautiful job in this text, as he has in all of his books, in putting forward a young girl who, through her own determination, figures out a series of problems and ends up doing things that are really helpful to herself and others. So it's a beautiful book, and it's well drawn. And I remember also from our conversation, we talked about how technically brilliant it was. Hatke is so awesome at drawing, basically highly beautiful splash pages, but then also extremely intricate pages that have a lot of panels and yet are really easy for a young reader to understand. And so, I was very happy to see that he won. He's such a great advocate for children's comics, and it was really exciting to see him get that notice from the Eisner Committee.
It really is nice. And, I have just a little story to tell about Ben Hatke. I met him a few years ago, and I actually interviewed him at a convention for the Comics Alternative. And we had talked about the possibility of him coming to our library and doing a program, because he doesn't live that far from where we are. And he says, yeah, I'd like to do it, but they had a conflict when we wanted him, and then I tried him again, and I couldn't get him, and then I tried him again, and now he's really such a big creator, a big star, that it would be almost impossible for us to get him at our little library. Oh,
Ben, if you're listening now, you got to help Andy out.
You got to help us, Ben.
His supporters, so head on up to Maryland. You can do it.
No, but I am tickled to death for Ben and for First Second. This is a great honor, and the book certainly deserves it, as does Ben and First Second.
Yeah, I was really excited for that. And, maybe this is a good point, too, before we move on to the next category, to talk about things where we sort of wish may have been there. And I know for me, there are a couple First Second books that came out in 2015 that I would have loved to have seen get some notice. One of them is the Stratford Zoo Midnight Review, presents Macbeth, which I think is a really wonderful text, and the Romeo and Juliet text, which came out in 2015. And also the First Second Well, I was a little bit surprised not to see Secret Coders either here or in the best publications for ages 9 through 12. I really love that series. We're going to be talking about it on our next show, actually. And so I was a little bit surprised about that. And also Human Body Theater by Mavis Wicks, which to me was probably one of the best children's books to come out last year, hands down, regardless of medium or genre. And so I was a little bit surprised about that. But for the most part, I thought these were really great entries. And I think all of them a child would be delighted to have access to these books.
Yeah, I think it's, I think it, like you, there are certain books that I wish, and those are also two books that I wish had been included in there. But, I know that the committee that puts this together, they go through hundreds and hundreds of books to decide. So I don't envy them that.
No, absolutely. That's such a great service that they do.
But it really is a great service. And, I think they did a really, really great job of giving us some really, really nice books for this category.
Absolutely. Do we want to move on to best publications for kids aged 9 through 12?
Yes, let's do that.
All right, I'll read them out, and then you can take it over, Andy. So we have Baba Yaga's Assistant by Marika Makula and Emily Carroll out of Candlewick. We have a nonfiction text, Child Soldier, When Boys and Girls Are Used in War by Jessica Dee Humphreys, Michel Chikwanine, and Claudia Devila, and that's Kids Can Press. Nathan Hale's Hazardous Tales, The Underground Abductor by Nathan Hale, and that's out of Abrams Amulet. We have Over the Garden Wall by Pat McHale, Amalia Levari, and Jim Campbell, and that is out of Boom Studios, and their even littler imprint, Kaboom, which I love.
I love that too.
That ad, Kaboom. Roller Girl by Victoria Jamieson out of Dial Books, and Sunny Side Up by Jennifer Holm and Matthew Holm out of Scholastic's Comics Imprint Graphics. So those were the contenders for best publication for kids aged 9 through 12.
And the winner of that category was Over the Garden Wall. And, Gwen, it's pretty funny because I was looking at this list and I realized, out of these 6 books, we talked about 4 of them on the podcast already. So, yeah, we're doing pretty good. We're picking some pretty good stuff here.
We can pat ourselves on the back.
That's right, a little pat ourselves on the back. I think Derek and Andy call that the comics alternative bump. When they mention something on the podcast and it gets nominated for an award, that's the bump. Well, and Gwen, I have to confess that the only book in this category that I have not read was the one that won, Over the Garden Wall. A few weeks ago, I tried to get a copy of Over the Garden Wall because I thought maybe it had been collected in a trade paperback or a hardcover. That has not come out yet, and I was looking online. That collection won't be published until September the 20th. And then I decided, well, I'll just go to my local comic shop and get the individual issues. And I went, and they said, we've been sold out for weeks. And I was like, oh, man. So actually, I have not gotten to read any of Over the Garden Wall, but I have read all of the other books in this category. Yeah,
our listeners should know that Over the Garden Wall is actually a companion to a children's television program. And it basically takes up where the story is on television and then sort of takes it in different directions. It reminds me a little bit of Fractured Fairy Tales, which was very popular when we were kids, Andy, as part of the sort of Rocky and Bullwinkle, Underdog. I don't know, that whole group of comics that would come out on Saturday. They had a subcomic like Fractured Fairy Tales. So this reminds me a little bit of that. It follows the experiences of 2 brothers who are catapulted into a fantastic world where interesting things happen. And it's a very sweet book. I was able to read the first issue. I haven't read, obviously, the collected volume as it hasn't come out yet, although I certainly will be doing that. But it was a little bit different than some of the other texts in this category. And it's a text that, honestly, I sort of would have expected to see in the younger reader category. And this was really actually the point I made before we went on air. This was where I started to talk a little bit about the slipperiness of categories and how sometimes, we understand why we have these age ranges, and these age ranges are completely commiserate with what's being done in the trades for, text-only YA narratives. So this isn't like Eisner did something that was out there. This is what the American Library Association does, etc. But I was a little bit surprised by this text because it does have the feel of something for a little bit younger reader, even than 9. But, but there you go. So, I thought Baba Yaga's Assistant might belong down in Best Publication for Teens. So that is the deal. So we're very happy for Pat McHale, Amalia Levari, and Jim Campbell. But there are also some other really strong texts in this category.
There really are. This is probably going into this, I would say this was the toughest category because so many of these books are really, really good. Just better than just above average. There's some really great books in here. One of the interesting things I thought about this category was so many of these books are either autobiographical or based on real events. Mm-hmm. And the only ones that we have that are fictional, Over the Garden Wall, and then Baba Yaga's Assistant, which is kind of based on a folk tale. But all the rest of these are really based in fact. And on the Comics Alternative website, and I know you contributed to this article too, but there's a great piece on the website by Beth Davies Stofka, the chair of liberal studies and college prep at Colorado Community Colleges. And she was making the case, and I think this is a great, great thing to bring up, about the Eisners possibly making a different category. Some of this is, she's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but in a way she's serious too, creating a comic or graphic novel most likely to change the world category.
I loved that, yeah.
I love that too. And if you, and Gwen, I don't think you got to read Child Soldier, is that right? Not yet?
That's correct. Yeah. I have it in my bookcase. I haven't had a chance to read it yet.
Wow, what a great, great story. And this is one of those change the world type of books. And just briefly, it's the story of Michel Chikwanine, a 5-year-old boy who was abducted from his school soccer game in the Democratic Republic of Congo and forced into the rebel militia. And this is a story of how he survived and how he returned home safely, but he was never the same. And the great thing about this book is it is one of those books that will shake you up. There's violence in the book, but the violence is really more evoked rather than depicted. We kind of see the results of the violence rather than seeing the violence itself. And this is such a tremendous book, and I hope that this gets in the hands of a lot more people since it did get nominated for the Eisner. And this is from Kids Can Press. It might be a little tough to find out, but I urge people to find this. Your local library probably has it. Just a tremendous book. And the same thing about Roller Girl and Sunny Side Up. These are really autobiographical comics about these young women and what their lives were like in these situations. They are just so honest and so wonderfully represented, and they're good stories as well. I could have picked any of these books, I think, for the award if I picked it, and I would have been happy with it. And then also we have Nathan Hale's Underground Tales, which is just a tremendous series. And this time Nathan Hale, the creator and the character, relate the story of Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. And that's another one of those life-changing books. You read these books, and, Gwen, a lot of times, I guess we all did this. As kids, we read comics to be entertained, and we wanted to have a good time. And these books certainly do that, but they also teach us some really, really deep life lessons.
Yeah, and I think now that so many comics creators are exploring different genres, it's exciting because kids are recognizing that there's all sorts of things they can get out of comics that are super positive, that go beyond just simple entertainment. And I would also say, not only do I agree with Beth about a new category, but I would love to see a nonfiction category at some point. I really think that that's a very particular type of genre that oftentimes even and uses different techniques and brings up different ethical questions. For instance, you think about Joe Sacco, who's written a lot about, drawing comics in war-torn zones, and how objective is he when the text is coming out of an author's pen, and then he pushes back, how objective are photographs? There's a photographer standing behind the camera making editing choices, etc. Right. So it brings up some interesting ideas, but also 3 of the books here, and then Drowned City, which is part of the best publications for teens. All of them are nonfiction, and it would be exciting to see perhaps someday a category that honors that type of writing. And since most of those texts do sort of change the world, maybe that would also answer Beth's call for graphic novels that are, or children's comics in general, that are really having a profound impact on how people view the world.
Yeah, I would love to see that happen. And, again, the great thing about this is kids, young readers are going to read this. And what we hope they'll do is we hope that they will, number one, be entertained, be moved. And then I hope they will ask some questions too, And, if they're young readers, hopefully they're going to ask their parents or their teachers, why did this happen? Or how did we allow this to happen? Like Child Soldier or the Underground Railroad. Things like that. How did we allow this to happen? And those types of things can generate some really great discussions, not just for the kids, but for the adults too.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, are we ready to move on to best publications for teens?
Yes.
All right. So this is ages 13 to 17. Do you want to read those out, my friend?
I'll be glad to. Yeah. And in this category, we have Awkward by Svetlana Chmakova. I hope that's right. By Yen Press. Drowned City, Hurricane Katrina and New Orleans by Don Brown. And that's from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. March, Book 2 by John Lewis, Andrew Iden, Nate Powell from Top Shelf IDW. Moose by Max de Radiguès. I don't know if that's correct, but I hope
sounds good.
From Conundrum Press. Oyster War by Ben Towle from Oni Press. And SuperMutant Magic Academy by Jillian Tamaki from Drawn and Quarterly. And Gwen, will you tell us the winner?
Yes, the winner was SuperMutant Magic Academy by Jillian Tamaki. So, yay, Jillian! Yay. Well, many of our listeners may know her as one of the Tamaki cousins. Her cousin Mariko and she have done 2 comics together. First, Skim, which won almost every award it could win in Canada, and started to sort of set their reputation in the United States. And then most recently, their award-winning This One Summer, a comic, a graphic novel that has gotten a lot of acclaim and won many awards. And so it's really exciting. This is Jillian Tamaki's first YA comic on her own, and it's really exciting that she has given us such a great comic, and that it was accorded the honor of an Eisner.
Yeah, and this comic has gotten a lot of attention since it was published, and it's won several other awards as well. And so the Eisner is just more icing on the cake for Tamaki and for Drawn and Quarterly. And Gwen, you and I were talking about the differences in a lot of these categories, and this is the teen category, which goes from ages 13 to 17. And numerically, that may not seem like a wide range, but it really is a wide range. And a lot of these books really do reflect that. And as we were talking earlier, I think SuperMutant Magic Academy goes to the very far end of that range, like the 17-year-olds, maybe 16-year-olds. It's a very mature young reader's book, while something like Awkward is probably toward the younger edge of that, like maybe 13, maybe even 12. Awkward is more of the innocent side, maybe, of the teen category in this case.
It feels more like a tween book.
It really does.
Yeah, absolutely. And Moose by Max de, I'm assuming it's Radiguès, but I could be wrong. I'm sorry, Max. But that text also has material in it that's definitely for the sort of further end 17, 18-year-old readers. I will say it's one of the most stunning books I've ever read. And it's pretty amazing. And we'll talk about it in a minute. But yeah, this is one of those categories where, again, I understand to a certain extent why the texts are where they are, but I expected Oyster War actually maybe to be in the category ahead of that, best publication for kids. Along with Awkward, but they're all really great texts. And I do want our listeners to know that March Book 2 did win for a different category. And so I'm really happy that book by Representative John Lewis and Andrew Aden and Nate Powell did get recognition, because talk about a book that can change your life. I mean, Representative Lewis wrote his autobiography in part to encourage young people to take action and to get into what he calls good trouble. So I'm pleased that in another category, I believe it was Best Series. I can look that up while we're hanging out here.
Actually, I think I have it here. That was the. It's coming. Wait for it. Actually, that was Best Reality-Based Work.
Okay, great. There's so many categories now, which is exciting. Well, see, they have that for adults. They need it for kids now. But anyway, but March Book 2 is a great book. So, we've talked about March Book 1. I'm hoping that Book 3 is coming out. Maybe we'll just do a whole March part of a show on March itself this fall or winter. But it's exciting that book is there. Have you read Drowned City, Hurricane Katrina and New Orleans?
I did read Drowned City, and I had read another book by Don Brown earlier about the Dust Bowl.
Okay.
And that I think they're both really, really good books. And I think the Dust Bowl book, even though it was farther removed from me as far as chronology, and I was not there. And of course, Katrina was very, very much on my mind because we saw it. We saw it happen on TV. I kind of felt like it was kind of in the same mold of the Dust Bowl book, which was, again, both are very, very good books. But I kind of felt like I had been here before, in a way, just because I'd read the other book. And the format is a little bit similar. But, that's not to take anything away from Don Brown or the power of Drowned City, Hurricane Katrina, and New Orleans, which is a tremendous book, and I do highly recommend it.
Also, if you'd like to feel old with me for a moment, the reality is that Katrina happened in 2005. So today's 13-year-olds were little kids at that point. And so for many of them, it may feel like that was a long time ago, even though for me it feels like it was, not that long. And actually, I was down there almost right after it. A good friend of mine is a professor at University of New Orleans, Ann Boyd. So Ann Boyd Rue, shout out to Ann. But she took me on a tour because her house had been destroyed, and it was so devastating to see it. So I was really excited to find that there was a graphic novel dedicated to it. And even though it's only been 11 years, I'm sure that for some of the kids who are encountering this text, they only had heard about it. They hadn't really experienced it the way that we had. So.
Yeah. That's true, and it's a lot like kids today and 9/11. I mean, we were obviously adults when that happened, but so many kids coming up now, they either were too young or they weren't even born during that. So yeah, this kind of goes into that category of books that are very, very recent history, but for some young readers, it may have happened before they were even cognizant of what was going on.
Yeah, it's interesting because I teach future educators, and one of the big debates in children's literature is whether or not young children are ready to read texts about things like terrorism, et cetera. And of course, where I stand on that. I think that kids should be exposed to factual information in a way that's appropriate for their age. But we have that discussion in class, and I'm at the point now, just at the point where my 18 to 20-year-olds now were too little to have been in a school setting when this occurred.
Wow.
Up until recently, it was, I was in middle school. Then it was like I was in grade school. And that was really interesting because for the last few years, we've been able to have that discussion. My third grade teacher let us, watch it on TV. Whereas, oh my gosh, no one, I didn't even know it had happened. My parents kept it from me. So you got those sort of debates, about children and innocence and that sort of thing. Well, now we're getting to the point where something that happened in 2001 for my 18-year-olds, they were 3 years old,
Wow.
So it kind of puts it, okay, I feel a little down. Let's move on.
Well, here's a book that's set in a period that I was not born in, not by a long shot. Oyster War, that we briefly spoke about just before, takes place in the late 19th century, and it's about a war that occurred, but it's probably not a war that you heard about. It was a war between the Chesapeake Bay oyster industry, around where I live, and a group of pirates. And Ben Towle's Oyster War is part historical, part fantasy. It combines history with pirates and sea creatures and a touch of the supernatural. Oyster War is one of these kind of big, oversized books, and it's really fun, and it's filled with humor and color and adventure. And Gwen, I think the only reason that this might have been put in the teen category and not in the earlier category, best publication for kids, there's a little bit of violence to it, and there's a little bit of maybe suggestive things going on. Not that much, but this is such a fun book. And actually, this would be a really, really fun book to, although it is, there's a lot of fiction in it, it would be a nice book to look at, especially where I live, kids on the Chesapeake Bay, to look at that and talk about the history of the oyster industry and how that all developed. But this is just a wonderful book that I hope gets into more people's hands.
Yeah, I know. It's a really great book. And I remember when we first were talking about it earlier this year, how excited you were. And it must be really great to have, a text come out that's set in a region where you live. That's great, you know?
Yeah, it is fun.
Well, the last two books in the category are Moose and SuperMutant Magic Academy. Again, Andy and I both probably would say that these are for older readers. And I'll just, if you'd like, I'll talk a little bit about Moose, and then we can move on to the winner. But okay. Moose is a text that focuses on bullying. And it's a story that builds slowly. Initially, the abuse that you see the primary character go through is standard sort of things that maybe many of us either experienced or saw happen in junior high and high school. A young boy who's somewhat sensitive and shy. He has his backpack taken. He gets called names. He gets beaten up. And he's obviously understandably frightened. But as the story moves on, we learn that Jason, who's the bully in this text, is actually far more vicious and cruel than we initially, at first I felt that this was going to be one of those kind of YA texts where a nice adult intervenes and turns out that Jason has some reasons for being who he is and everything gets sorted out. That's not what happens. And I don't want to give too much away for our readers because I think that the way that the story unfolds is part of its magic and part of its power. But what I will say is by the end of the text, the primary character is left with a very difficult ethical decision. Initially, he's trying to make it on his own. Ultimately, he makes it with another boy who has been bullied by Jason. And the decision that they make is pretty stunning. And I think it would, I hope that this text gets into a lot of people's hands because one of the things I took away from it, and Andy, I'll be interested to see what you thought, but is that we really need to get beyond a time when well-meaning adults look the other way when kids are being bullied, especially when they get older. In other words, the kind of bullying that happens that borders into serious abuse. And it's not only traumatic for the person who's being bullied, but it's clear that the people who are doing the bullying need more than just attention.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
So I think this book actually, if it gets in enough hands, has the potential to really lead to some important discussion.
Yeah, and this is a book, Gwen, that Derek and I actually discussed, I guess maybe over a year ago when we were doing a publisher spotlight on Conundrum Press, and we both, this was one of the strongest books in that entire spotlight, and that we probably looked at about a dozen books, and I think this was probably one of the edgiest books that we took a look at. I agree with you as far as bullying goes. This is the type of book that it is shocking, and there are some things in it that are very difficult to deal with. But bullying that's our world. I mean, bullying is that way. I mean, there are things that are shocking going on, and this is not only a great story, but this is a great opportunity to face those issues and talk with kids that maybe they are being bullied, maybe they're not. But this is something that we can't ignore. And like you said, Gwen, I think that too often in our culture we just ignore it. Or, maybe we think, well, our kids aren't being bullied, so, it's not something that I'm really worried about. This is a huge problem. This book does deal with it in a very, very powerful way. This is from it's not an American creator, however you said his name.
Radiguès, I think.
Radiguès is based in Brussels, so it's not going to have what we might think of as any American sugarcoating. It is right there, and what you see is what you see, and it's a story that you're forced to deal with on some level. And like you said, Gwen, the characters at the end of it, they deal with the situation in a certain way that might be disturbing and it might be shocking. But bullying is disturbing and shocking. And this is a very, very honest book. And again, like you said, I hope a lot of people will have the opportunity to read this. This is a book that you'll probably have to seek out. Conundrum is a small press, so it might be difficult to find, but I urge you to seek it out.
Yeah, it's amazing. And, it's interesting because SuperMutant Magic Academy feels much more mainstream to me, yet it too is dealing with a lot of the difficulties that young people have growing up. It's just that it's doing it with, I would say, a little bit more humor. It's not meant to be the same sort of book, so I'm not trying to compare them. But there are some serious topics that are dealt with, and this text too. The premise is sort of like it takes some of the aspects of Harry Potter, the Harry Potter series, especially the school story aspect of it. And sets it in a situation where the characters are older teens, but a lot of the humor is put forward initially in what feel like sort of unconnected gags. So you'll have a page where there's about 6 panels, and there's sort of a concept or an idea is brought up, and by the last panel you're laughing because there's been a funny gag. You don't start to see how all of these different gags are brought together until you start to get deeper and deeper into the text, where characters start to reappear, their relationships with each other begin to solidify. And so there's a cast of characters, all very different kinds of kids. What they do have in common is that each of them is in some way has some sort of mutation. So there's I think there's a person who's a dolphin who has supersonic hearing and can hear people, doesn't have ears, but can hear people making fun of him. There's this young man named Chaz, and you don't even know his name until about 2/3 of the way through the book, who every 3 hours has to go into a special device because his molecules just dissolve. And he, and it's shown like what happens in his mind when he dissolves. He has all these different things going on, and then there's, some of the characters you never really understand or learn what their mutation is, but they may have, for instance, one character has a huge pompadour hairdo beehive hairdo, and you kind of know that something's going on under that hair, and one character has an actual cat head, whereas another character just has cat ears. So it's kind of fascinating. These kids are all, it reminds me a little bit of Charles Burns' Black Hole, which is a text, sort of much darker text that is set in a high school setting, and characters begin to take on mutations because they've come up with a disease that at the time Burns was trying to use as a metaphor for AIDS, and the way that the people treated individuals who are diagnosed with AIDS. This isn't quite doing that. But it's a sweet book. There's a lot of humor in it, and it shows you kids just at the cusp of like being really frustrated by things that adults have told them all their life and being old enough to sort of see through those things, but also being young enough so that they're still really hurt by it and definitely notice the difference. I guess maybe that's the way I would put it. What's your reaction to the text?
I really like the way you put the Harry Potter thing in there, because it does have that feel to it, because it is a magic academy, and that is definitely true. But I also kind of thought this is kind of like what the characters from Peanuts would be as teenagers.
I love it,
because they're so many of them are really snarky, and like you said, they've bought into some of the stuff that adults have been telling them for years, and now they're just figuring out, hey, this is just a bunch of junk, and it's really funny, and it's really it's just that type of kids figuring out things on their own, and they don't have all the answers, but they feel like they do have all the answers in some ways, but it's clear that they don't. But I really like what you said about character and the way that character is revealed. We get to know these characters slowly, and they kind of evolve through the pages as we turn, and we learn a little bit more about them. And in that way, too, it's kind of like a comic strip, a comic strip that we read for, day after day, week after week, year after year. You start to learn more and more about these characters. And by the end of it, when it's over, you feel like, well, these are kind of friends of mine that I'm really going to miss, now that the book is over. But it does have that... like we said before, this is probably the far end of the teen category. It is snarky. It does have some profanity in it, and it's a little edgy, but it is so funny and is so on target, I think, with the way some teenagers will think.
Yeah, let me give you an example, actually, dear listeners, because this is very early in the text and it doesn't give away any of the super plot, but you have a couple kids sitting in a classroom, and Andy, this is on page 11, and in the first panel, there's a cat who's in the foreground sleeping on a desk, and the two other kids are sitting, I think it's in the lunchroom, actually, and one says, I still don't see why a cat gets to attend SuperMutant Magic Academy. It doesn't even have a super ability. It's not fair. And in the next panel, there's a close-up on the boys, and one says their headmaster is called Grimdorf, as opposed to, it's sort of like taking Gryffindor and whatever, and Dumbledore and whatever. Grimdorf says that he'll play a pivotal part of a future epic battle between the forces of good and evil. I hardly think we're in a position to argue. And the boy says, I guess. So, in other words, the cat is going to save the day the way Harry did, right? And then in the third panel, the cat, after saying this, I don't think we're in a position to argue. The cat is licking its behind. And the guys are like, ew, come on.
That is, yeah, that's a perfect representation of what the whole book is like.
But it does really get at that, There's a point after which, and the thing is, Harry Potter starts off as a text for very young readers and moves the kids up through high school. But, there is a point at which, as an adult, you step back and you're like, okay, this is the typical hero cycle. Yeah, he's the chosen one, etc. Well, if the chosen one is a cat and the cat sits around just licking himself, it's like, great. What does that mean about us then? So it's a very that's a very lighthearted part of it. It's really a very funny, inventive book. And I will say one other thing about it is it's a book where readers have to work pretty hard to piece everything together. It's not just handed to the reader. And while you can read each individual panel as a standalone gag, ultimately, they do work together. So it's a text that does have a narrative. That structure is just a little bit less obvious. And in fact, that kind of subtlety I really appreciate. So
yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because there's a lot of subtlety, and there's a lot of dark humor and a lot of depth in it. And there were so many of them so many pages that you might read, and pretty much an episode, I guess you would say, is a page long. So each page is kind of a new episode. But there are a lot of them that you would read and think, okay, what just happened? Things like that. And a teenager would recognize, okay, I recognize that situation, but I never thought of it that way. That type of thing. And I think that's one of the great strengths of the book as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Chaz's issue, you don't really know until, like I said, about 2/3 of the way through the book, you're not sure what his super ability is, and there are certain pages that deal with him where really weird things happen. Like he's sitting with what looks to be his girlfriend, who's a bird, like a human-sized bird, right? And then he's sitting by himself. Then there's a panel where there's a cane, like an elderly person's cane. And then there's a panel where the bird is elderly and is there still holding his hand, and he looks just the same. And then in the final panel, I think she's either gone or she's a skeleton. And so what Tamaki's doing there is showing that this guy's body keeps on moving through different points in time, and he can't necessarily control it. But when I was first reading through it, I'm like, okay, that's interesting. I don't know what the heck's going on. And it was late, but eventually you get answers to everything that you see. And also, I would say, just as a sort of maybe a finishing point, this is a text that also deals with characters who are going through an understanding of their sexual identity and also their gender identity, and it deals with that in a very sensitive and kind way, and therefore it makes it really a book that I think a whole range of readers would really enjoy. There's a lot of, let me put it this way, every possible type of adolescent appears in this text, and so there's a lot for readers to identify with and to recognize as they read the book.
Wow, well, Gwen, we've covered quite a few books here on the Eisner Awards special. And again, these are only the young adults or the young readers categories, the 3 categories. And if you're interested, there are many, many more categories of the Eisners, many, many more books to explore. But since we are doing the Young Readers Show, we wanted to spotlight those. And we hope that we will give you several books to consider, maybe that you hadn't thought about before, maybe that you haven't even heard of before. And some of these books you can find at our sponsor, DCB Service, or their sister company, In Stock Trades. You go to the website and you'll find lots of amazing comics priced at 30% off or more. And after you get your comics there, get in touch with us and let you know what you think about these books, and maybe even let us know what you think about the Eisner Awards. You might think of some categories that maybe we haven't thought of that the Eisner Committee should consider. You can contact us by going to our website at comicsalternative.com, and on the right-hand side of your browser, you'll see a tab that reads Send Voicemail. You can click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. Or if you want to be old school, you can call us on the telephone.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun, at 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. Or you can contact us by email at the number 2guys@comicsalternative.com. Or you can get in touch with us individually. I'm Wolverton at comicsalternative.com. And Gwen, how can people reach you?
Folks can reach me at gwen@comicsalternative.com, although I will say my university is switching over its email, and right now I don't have access to the account because of all sorts of password trauma. But you can also get in touch with me at gwen.tarbox@wmich.edu. So, and that's my public address. And you can also find us on Twitter, where we announce new content to our podcasts and updates to our blog. And we are on Twitter, the @2 guys with PhDs.
And you can also find us on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and Gwen, what's the one I always forget?
Spotify.
Spotify! I almost said it and I thought, I'm not sure if that's it.
No, it is. That's cool.
I know the Spotify people probably hate me. They're like, why can't you?
No, they don't. Everyone likes you. It's okay.
Well, thank you. We also have a YouTube channel, so you can access us that way. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us on TuneIn. And you can discover every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and comics-related commentary on our blog at comicsalternative.com. And you're probably listening to this episode on Monday, and I wanted to let you know that Gwen and I will be back tomorrow to do our regular show on 3 new comics for young readers. So please do check us out tomorrow as well. Until next time, I'm Andy.
And I'm Gwen. See you soon.
Bye.